Hello and welcome to this presentation of Foundation Giving Trends 2021. We're looking at the key findings from this year's Foundation Giving Trends report, looking at the key facts and figures on giving income and assets of the top UK independent charitable foundations. My name is Richard Hebditch. I'm Director of External Affairs at the Association of Charitable Foundations, and I'm joined today by the two authors of the report, so Dr. Kat Walker from the Researchery and Professor Cathy Farrow from Bayes Business School. So we're going to talk through the findings and in some detail, and hopefully you can find out a bit more about it, and we'll discuss what this might mean for the foundation sector. We're really pleased to have the support of Pears Foundation, who help make sure that we can able to do the research every year, so I'd just like to thank them at the beginning of this presentation. And maybe I could just turn to you, Cathy, just to maybe describe a bit of the background for Foundation Giving Trends, a bit about where it's come from and what we're trying to do with this as well.
Hi. Well, the idea for this series originally did come from the Pears Foundation in 2007. Amidst growing private wealth, they were keen to get a benchmark of how much Britain's wealthy families were giving to philanthropy and to track it so that they could encourage other families to join in and give more. And they asked if the methodology that had been used in the Charities Aid Foundation's Charity Trends, later published by Charity Financials, could be adapted to look at family foundations. The first challenge was to get a definition of family foundations, because the term was widely used in the US at the time, where there are many family foundations, but it wasn't used in the UK. And that's when we decided to follow the US tradition and define family foundations as those which were funded primarily by the wealth of a private family, individual, or a family business. And initially, we only published tables on the family foundations. And I don't know if you can see this. I brought along the first edition, which looks nothing like as smart as what we're producing now. Then in 2013, we developed a collaboration with ACF and widened out our reporting on foundations to include the top 300, including family foundations and corporate foundations. And I think it's important to be aware that the dividing up the foundation universe in that way was innovative at the time, but has now really become a very established part of how we look at foundations and how we study them. And I feel that's something we've contributed through this series.
Thanks, Cathy. And for us at ACF, it's a particularly important year for us to be publishing this. So this is looking at the accounts from 2019-20, and it looks at the impact of COVID in those initial months for how foundations responded to it. And also, obviously, 2020 was the year of the Black Lives Matter protests, so we looked a little bit at that as well. Maybe we can move on to the methodology a little bit. I think we're just going to quickly talk to people about how we go about, or how Cathy and Kat go about selecting foundations and how we deal with that. So over to you, Cathy.
Thank you. Well, it's important to remember that the way we sort of slice up the foundation universe is purely functional, and it's designed to suit our key research purposes. There are no legal definitions for different kinds of foundation. They all have the same legal form, the same constitution, and all are registered, like all charities, with the Commission. And that means we have to select foundations from the register using defining criteria which are set out very clearly in the report. And there's always an element of personal judgment involved, because foundations are not formally identified in different categories. And from time to time, foundations do query our judgments, and we're always open to discussing this and to amending our inclusions and exclusions where appropriate. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but I wanted to mention a couple of other aspects of the methodology, which are a bit of a challenge in coming up with a reliable annual benchmark. The first one is that our data is always a year behind, because charities, as you will know, generally take a year to report their finances, just like on our tax forms. And some people do find this a bit frustrating, but we have to live with it. And the further complication is that charities have varying year ends in their annual reports. They might report to the calendar year, the fiscal year, or an individually chosen financial year. There's also the challenge of generating a reliable annual benchmark where the finances of one particular organisation, the Wellcome Trust, so vastly outstrip all the other foundations that a single change in the figures for the Wellcome Trust can skew all of our results. So to deal with this, we always stress test our results, including and excluding the Wellcome Trust. And where necessary, we do report them separately. And it's worth noting that we're not unique in this, because the US data, for example, has to encompass bodies like the massive Gates Foundation. How and which foundations that we choose for inclusion in the report is a key issue, and one we're often asked about, though we do set out the methodology in the report quite fully. Contrary to what some people think, foundations are not chosen primarily by the scale of their grant making or their assets per se. They're chosen firstly by whether they are primarily funded through private philanthropic rather than statutory or other funds. Having done that, we then rank them by the scale of their giving and grant making. Now, why did we take this approach? Well, there's two main reasons. The first is that it enables us to get a measure of the unique additional financial contribution, or the added financial value made by private philanthropy in the UK. In other words, what private philanthropy adds to public spending. And secondly, we do this because it enables stakeholders like governments to see the leverage of subsidies such as our generous system of tax reliefs and other state incentives like matched funding schemes, to see what leverage they have in encouraging people to give. So measuring private giving through foundations doesn't capture all private giving in the UK, but it does provide one authoritative benchmark. And finally, I would say that through our research on foundations, we can assess the contribution made by foundations to the general funding of civil society. And we can map that landscape, which is what Catherine's going to be talking about. But it's coming back to the point I raised earlier about the element of selection. The lens through which we measure foundations focuses on foundation grant making as a measure of major private giving in the UK. And there are other lenses which could be chosen to look at the foundation world, and which would produce different lists. And some of these are illustrated on the slide and in the report. For example, if you only wanted to measure which foundations were the biggest in terms of money flow through, you might include those which are funded from mixed sources and include government funds as well as philanthropic funds, for example, the British Council and the community foundations. And you might include foundations that are supported through government mandates and levies, like the Royal Society of Wildlife Trusts or Nesta. You might include highly specialised foundations which are not available for general grant making for civil society and only fund a very narrow area of interest, such as the Royal Academy of Engineering or the Dulwich Estate. So back to you.
Thanks, Kathy. So I think we're going to move on now to look at grant making. So Kat's going to talk us through that, but I just wanted to pick up those really interesting points about kind of the level of sort of interaction with governments as well. I think it's an issue that we'll come up with as we talk through the findings this year. So I'm going to hand over to Kat, who's going to talk a bit about the grant making results.
Thank you. So 2019-20 was another year where we saw strong growth in grant making by the top 300. And you can see that most clearly by looking at the orange bars on this chart, which exclude Wellcome Trust, which, as we've just heard, can have a massive skew on the figures sometimes. So including Wellcome Trust, we actually found that total grant making reached a record high this year of 3.48 billion. And underlying that strong growth, we found that over half of foundations saw a real terms increase in their grant making this year. So just moving on to the next slide, we also saw that there were some pretty big increases in grants by some individual foundations. So to give you a couple of examples, here we've got the David and Claudia Harding Foundation, whose £100 million donation to Cambridge University is thought to be the single biggest gift ever given to a UK university by British philanthropists. And another big increase we saw at the Dunnard Fund, which operates in Scotland, which increased its grant making by 23 million this year. And the Dunnard Fund is a major contributor to music and the arts, and it's committed to a long-term programme of funding towards constructing the Dunnard Centre in Edinburgh, which is a new all-purpose performance venue.
I think one of the interesting points for me is also the kind of the sustaining of grant making in this period as well. So we're going into this period, it was the period of sort of general election, lots of uncertainty about Brexit, the economy was fairly sluggish as well. And then going into COVID, obviously there was that very big economic hit at the beginning of 2020. But despite that, it's quite interesting that foundations have continued to maintain or increase their grant spending and consciously choosing to do so.
Yeah, I think we have seen a big commitment amongst the top 300 foundations, essentially to their grantees. And I think that obviously reflects foundations' desire to maintain their spending levels and even increase them where possible. And as you say, that's despite the economic and socio-political upheavals that we've had in the last few years. So I think really it does show that there's a great fortitude and even bravery amongst foundation staff and trustees, because they know how much they're relied upon by their grantees. And
of course, as we were saying, we're kind of going into the COVID period. So you also looked at that as well, Kat. Maybe you can write some of the things that you found from looking at the accounts.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, the arrival of COVID-19 has had a massive impact on everyone. But as usual, it's charities who really have been left to pick up the pieces where the system's kind of faltered or failed. And charities have obviously needed additional funding and extra resources to do that. So although in this edition of Foundation Giving Trends, we only really had 20% of the top 300 whose years covered a significant amount of the beginning of the pandemic, we still were able to identify the swift and often extraordinary responses of foundations to this crisis. So in the report, you'll find an overview which is the result of a qualitative analysis of a sample of 50 of the top 300 foundations. And we've illustrated the common themes and approaches that we found in that analysis. So, for example, we found that foundations often responded by changing some of their grant-making practices and doing that almost overnight. For example, some foundations were more flexible in their grant timetables, or in shifting or widening the aims of existing grants, or in broadening the criteria for inclusion. Some introduced faster turnaround times to approve their grants, and others gave more core cost or unrestricted funding, which obviously provides the freedom then for grantees to use the money as they see fit in what was really a very fast changing environment. And we saw a lot of foundations opening up more dialogue with their grantees in order to be more effective in their funding. And also we saw a lot more collaboration with other funders and also with government, which we'll come on to. We also saw foundations committing significant amounts to emergency grants, emergency funding for COVID. And in fact, this analysis of the 50 foundations found over £155 million worth of COVID grants were given in the first 9 months of the pandemic. And on average, that represented over a third, 37% of the value of the foundation's previous year's grant making. And we also found that the sample, additionally to that, distributed over £6 million worth of government funding during that period.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, and it's something that we found in our surveys of ACF members as well, about foundations trying their best to be flexible with existing grantees, sometimes reaching out to new organisations as well to fund, and also trying to maintain or increase spending and hoping to do so afterwards as well. And you also found sort of examples, I think, around sort of responding to Black Lives Matter as well, in terms of some of the things that foundations were committing to in response to that, and recognising this isn't just a kind of a one-off, it's also something that requires long-term work and also a recognition of kind of some of the historic sort of pressures as well.
We did, yes. I mean, obviously this was quite a year for everyone with COVID going on, and then the Black Lives Matter issues surfaced, and quite a few foundations found that they had to face some difficult truths about their past. And many, as you said, have issued apologies and statements regarding things like historical gains from slavery. So we did see a lot of this, and we found that foundations are generally seeing this as the start of the journey, not the end of one. And so a lot of them have committed to creating a more equitable future, one in which it allows people to challenge their legitimacy to act and helps them to connect with the most relevant organisations to fight certain fights. And I'll just give you one example of that to illustrate what some are doing. So the Esme Fairbairn Foundation have committed to being transparent about how many organisations they support that are led by people either from racialised communities or who are deaf or disability led. And that's just sort of one example of the many, many things that foundations are facing up to in this kind of new world.
Okay, thanks, Kat. We were next going to turn to a slide that Kathy was working on, so around the rate of growth compared to the economy as a whole. So we talked just now about sustained kind of increases in grant making. Maybe you could talk us through this slide, Kathy?
Yes, well, we might start with thinking about why we did this piece of analysis at all. And the reason is that without some way of normalizing our findings, of comparing them with something, we've really no idea whether our results about foundations and spending are the good, the bad, or the ugly. Are they poor, normal, and much to be expected, or unusual in some way? And what we can see from this long-term analysis is that our philanthropic assets held by foundations have grown strongly on the back of growing capital markets over the last couple of decades. And this has generated a valuable and sustainable funding source for civil society and the many important social causes that we want to support. The similarly strong growth rates in foundation spending to assets show that foundations have passed the value of this growth in philanthropic wealth onto funding and onto social causes, generating a resource which has been growing faster than other aspects of the economy. And this has meant foundation funding becoming more important at a time of downward pressure on other sources of spending, such as, for example, local authority support for the voluntary sector. And it's also led to increasingly high expectations of foundation wealth and what foundations can do. And I think you had a few thoughts about that, Richard.
Yeah, I think for ACF, one of the things that we've been thinking about is as the foundation sector becomes more important as a source of funding for good causes, and for the charity sector in particular, there will be increasing expectations of how foundations should be behaving as well. So rather than being a smaller, perhaps marginal element in the funding, they become more important. So it's more important about how they make decisions. It's more important around issues around transparency, issues around power, and it's been a big important aspect of the Stronger Foundations programme that ACF has been running. So helping foundations to think through what ambitious practice looks like, but also what I think accountable practice looks like, and what the kind of expectations might be from other actors in civil society about how foundations behave. And I think it's important to kind of to think about this in this context as foundations have maintained or increased their levels of grant making and spending overall. I think we're going to move on now to look at income, which I think is you, Kat. So some interesting findings around the balance of income growth this last year.
Yeah, absolutely. So this year we've seen a continuing trend in the fall in investment income, but we've actually seen very strong growth in voluntary income. So overall, that meant that we saw that total income grew relatively robustly by 8.7% to a total of 4.3 million. And now a lot of that voluntary income increase was due to large gifts into a relatively small number of foundations. So if we look at the next slide, we'll actually see there were quite a few large gifts of shares this year, or the proceeds of shares sold. So I've given you a couple of examples here. We've got the AKO Foundation, which recorded an increase of £250 million in this year, which was a result of major new giving from its founder, Nikolai Tangen, on his departure from AKO Capital and that foundation's board. We also saw a huge gift of £100 million worth of shares from Sir Brian Souter, I can't say his name, Sir Brian Souter, into the Souter Charitable Trust. Now, a lot of these gifts happened before the pandemic, but we also actually saw some direct evidence of the effects of the pandemic on giving. So, for example, BBC Children in Need benefited from an extra £26.6 million from its share of the Big Night In, which it jointly hosted with Comic Relief. And Comic Relief received 28.4 million from that. And that was a fundraiser that was specifically aimed at raising funds for those hardest hit by COVID-19. And those amounts are also match funded by DCMS. And I think, Richard, you were
we had some interesting conversations about trying to sort of pick out where government funding comes into the account. So we are trying to track private philanthropic giving through foundations, and it gets to be quite tricky in terms of looking at the accounts. That's right, isn't it, Kat?
It does, yes. Actually, before I talk about that, I was just going to make a point about something that we discussed before, which is the difference between fundraising foundations and those that are given money by families or individuals. And it was just to say that obviously those who are fundraising, of which we do have a few in the top 300, those who rely on fundraising or trading income were really badly hit during the pandemic. And that's not to say that others that rely on individual or family money weren't affected, but they were perhaps differently affected. And a lot for those foundations has depended on when their year ends fell and how the market was doing at that point. But we'll come back to that when we talk about assets. But yes, to go on to the point about government funding, I sort of touched on it briefly, but we've seen a lot more collaboration over the last few years between funders, and that's between foundations and between funders and government. And that's a fantastic to see, and we've tried to highlight that wherever possible because it's stronger together and all that. But it can cause a little bit of a headache for us as researchers, because as Kathy was explaining, this foundation giving trends is really about trying to focus on accurately assessing the unique additional funding that comes from philanthropically funded foundations. So that means we've got to try to exclude funding that comes from government and exclude funding where it's double counting because it's coming from other foundations. And where we can do that, we try to do that so that we take those amounts out of the calculations. And this year, I think we took out over £15 million worth of collaborative funding from other funders, from the income side of things. And we took out over £6 million from the grants calculation. So that's something we do on an ongoing basis, but just to sort of flag up that it was particularly difficult this year because of all the COVID collaborations that were going on.
Yeah, I think it's one of the differences between foundation giving trends and also the 360 giving research that's recently been published on COVID, which was included some of the government distributed funding as well as there being over a longer time period as well compared to the examples we were looking at.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think for me also it's interesting if government is looking to foundations to distribute government funding because of the skills and expertise that foundations may have. There may also be issues around government then requiring foundations to act in ways that aren't foundations at their best. So being more like government. So there are kind of risks around that as well. And we've seen some of the funding pots being quite short term from government as well. So things that have to be distributed very quickly within the financial year in terms of kind of keeping the Treasury happy. So there's a balance. And obviously foundations are well placed to work out what works for them, but it's an issue I think that we'll look to be discussing with the Cabinet Office, who are in charge of government grant making, and also DCMS as well in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Should we move on then to look at assets? So Kathy, I think you're covering this.
Well, as the chart shows, assets reached a high of 72 billion in value, including the Wellcome Trust, but they have seen slowing growth rates in the most recent years, and excluding the Wellcome Trust, the overall growth rate was negative in 1920. Now, of course, that included the first sort of quarter of 2020 when markets tumbled as the COVID pandemic began to hit us and we realized its implications. So no doubt the results for 2021 will show considerable bounce back as the markets picked up again later in 2020. Foundations, of course, like all investors, take a whole mix of approaches to maintaining or maximizing the value of their investments. I mean, they have a huge philanthropic asset there to steward and to look after. And they tackle this in different ways, including investing in overseas equities. And because their spending is based on long-term investments and a mix of different kinds of assets, including property, spending can often hold up in the short to medium term. And you can have a good year spending the year after assets grew strongly, even if in the year of the spending, assets were not growing so strongly, because there's often a year's time lag between asset growth and spending growth. But ultimately, of course, if there was a prolonged slowdown in global economic growth, it would mean lower investment gains for foundations and fewer resources available for annual philanthropic gifts. Spending would inevitably fall, and foundations would be faced with even harder prioritizing than they are now, and we've already touched on that a bit. This could become very challenging as the global climate crisis and the potentially longer-term impacts of the coronavirus, which is still really quite an unknown and quite unpredictable, as all of these new forces throw up powerful new funding demands. And that's why it's so important to keep growing the philanthropic pie and to encourage more of the wealthiest groups in our society to donate some of their assets to philanthropy, which was the sort of underlying mission of the research when we started this series. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, I think it's a really good point about sustaining growth as well, increasing numbers of demands for philanthropic support, foundation support as well, and being able to meet that. We often kind of in conversations about kind of, as you were saying, kind of climate funding needs to increase. Funding for work around racial justice needs to increase. There's a kind of growing inequality in society. Need to maintain kind of the arts and heritage and culture sectors after a very bad year through COVID. So there's lots of demands for traditional support from foundations, but also rising new demands as well. And it's a real challenge. Interesting points to what you were saying about also being able, how much of that rise in grant making and spending can be sustained if asset values don't increase as well. But it's a really good point. We're going to turn now to look in a bit more detail at family and corporate foundations. So I'm going to hand over back to Kat to cover that.
Yeah, so this slide shows a couple of things. So on the left, you'll see the pie chart shows the makeup of the top 300 foundations in terms of sort of the top line typology that we use. So whether they're a family or personal foundation, whether they're a corporate foundation, or whether they are what we've called here other independent foundation. And you'll see that family foundations very much dominate the top 300 in terms of the value of grant making. So they account for just over 3/5 of the total value of grant making in 2019-20, whilst corporate foundations account for just 6% of the grant making by volume. And it's very much the family foundations, certainly in this year, that are underpinning the growth in the top 300 grant making, as you can see on the chart on the right. So we saw that grant making by family and personal foundations grew by nearly a quarter, so over 23% this year, while corporate giving actually fell by just over 12% in real terms. And of the family foundations that we see making an increase, we've already talked about the David and Claudia Harding Foundation and the Dunnard Fund made significant increases. There was also the Arcadia Fund that increased its grant making by 34 million, and the Sigrid Rousing Trust that increased its grant making by over 21 million. So these are, significant sort of increases in a small number of foundations.
Thanks, Kat. Yeah, no, it's really interesting. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the next issue of Foundation Giving Trends in terms of corporate foundations as well. And if asset values bounce back and the economy bounces back, as it seems to have done over the last year at least.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, because in the data that we see in this year, we're not seeing that fall particularly linked to COVID, which is what we might have expected, but we'll be definitely looking out for that next year.
Okay, thank you. And then the final slide is just showing you the top 20 foundations.
Yeah, so the foundation world is a very skewed world with a few very, very big foundations at one end and a long tail of small foundations at the other. And these are the top foundations in the top 300 report. And they actually account for over half of the grant making, so 53% of the grant making in this edition and 69% of the assets. You can see the finances are very much weighted towards the top. And that's obviously not to say that smaller foundations are not important, but it's to say that the focus of foundation giving trends is very much on the finances. And that's why a lot of the examples and the changes that we highlight in the report obviously relate to the top, the bigger foundations, because that's where we see the changes that make the most effect. But just also to say that there's obviously also huge diversity in the sector in terms of kind of models of operation. I mean, we've talked about the top typology of family versus corporate versus other, but there are lots of other ways to cut the foundation world. As the old saying goes, when you've seen one foundation, you've seen one foundation. So there's a lot going on underneath these top line figures.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think it's an important point about the as you're saying, the long tail of smaller foundations, but also how important they are for many causes and many organisations as well. And actually, if they're often funding at smaller amounts, they may be responsible for more of the interactions between foundations and wider civil society. So that's really important. And ACF have just published a new piece of work looking at smaller foundations, looking at some of the sort of particular advantages they may have in pursuing ambitious practice that you might think bigger ones will be able to resource, but actually there are advantages for smaller foundations and being able to be more agile as well. So thank you very much to Kat and Kathy. It's a really worthwhile report, so do have a look. It's available on the ACF website, which is on the screen at the moment. We've gone into more detail this year because we thought it was such an important year, particularly kind of going into the pandemic, to look at how foundations are reporting. We've got lots of interesting examples of what foundations are doing. So Kat and Kathy covered some of those as we were talking today. But thank you very much for joining us, and do have a look at the full report. This year we also are publishing a spreadsheet of the top 300 as well, so you can play around with that and see, kind of compare some of those figures. This is also online, obviously on our website, and the full report is too. So thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.